I never thought a gravel driveway could start a war, but that's exactly what happened. One afternoon, I was sitting on my front porch with a glass of iced tea, watching traffic move through our little corner of western Tennessee, when I noticed something strange. 3 SUVs turned off the county road, rolled through my gate opening, passed right in front of my barn, and continued across my property like they had every right to be there. At first, I figured somebody was lost. It happens. GPS sends people down all kinds of wrong roads. But then I noticed a woman standing outside, one of the vehicles waving her hands and smiling. She wasn't lost. She was giving a tour. And somehow, my driveway had become part of it. My name is Caleb Mercer. I live alone on a little over 2 acres outside of town called Ashford Creek. The property belonged to my grandfather before me. It isn't fancy. There's an old red barn, a workshop, a pond that never stays full in the summer, and a long gravel driveway that cuts across the front section of the land before connecting to the highway. It's peaceful, or at least it used to be. Across the road, a developer had started building a small neighborhood called Willow Glen. 10 new homes, white fences, decorative mailboxes, all the things people imagine when they picture suburban life. At first, I didn't mind. Progress is progress. People need places to live. The trouble started when buyers began showing up. Willow Glen's official entrance connected to a narrow county road that backed up every morning and every evening. Meanwhile, my driveway offered a straight shot to the highway. Faster, easier, more convenient. Apparently, convenience is all some people need to convince themselves that private property belongs to everyone. The first few times I noticed strange vehicles crossing my land, I let it go. Then it became a daily thing. Delivery vans, contractors, landscaping crews, prospective buyers. They would swing onto my driveway, cut across the property, and exit as if they were driving through a public access road. I installed a sign that said private driveway, and no, through traffic. The next morning, a pickup truck drove right past it. A week later, somebody nearly clipped one of my fence posts. Another week after that, I found tire tracks running through part of my grass because someone had tried turning around near the barn. Every day, it got a little worse. The thing that bothered me most wasn't the traffic itself. It was the attitude. Nobody asked permission. Nobody knocked on my door. Nobody even pretended to care. It was like they had collectively decided that because my driveway was useful, it no longer belonged to me. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. I heard engines outside and looked through the workshop window. A realtor was leading 3 families through the property. Not beside the property, through it. She was standing near my barn, pointing toward the highway, while people nodded and took pictures. I walked out wiping grease from my hands and asked what exactly was going on. She smiled the kind of smile people use when they think they can talk their way out of anything. "We're just showing potential buyers an alternate route," she said. I remember staring at her for a second because I honestly thought I had misheard. An alternate route to what? I asked. She held up a brochure and pointed to a highlighted map. That's when I felt my stomach drop. My driveway was printed on the map, not just drawn accidentally, labeled, included, presented as an access point for the neighborhood. I looked at the brochure again just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. Right there at the bottom was the developer's company logo, Hartwell Communities, and underneath that, the name of the owner, Mason Hartwell. I called him that evening. To his credit, he answered. To his discredit, he acted like the entire thing was completely normal. "It's temporary," he said. "The county plans to improve the road eventually. So until then, you're advertising my property as part of your development?" I asked. "Everybody benefits," he replied. "Better access means happier buyers." I actually laughed when he said that because it was such a ridiculous thing to hear. Happier buyers. As if my property existed to improve his sales numbers. As if my driveway was some community amenity he had purchased and forgotten to mention. The conversation ended with neither of us happy. But after I hung up, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Something fell off. Too much confidence. Too much certainty. Mason spoke like he already owned the situation. And people don't usually act that way unless they think they have legal cover. So the next morning, I drove into town and visited the county records office. I explained the situation to a woman named Denise who had probably spent 30 years sorting through property documents. She searched the records, looked through several maps, then looked back up at me over her glasses. No easement, she said. No public access rights. No shared roadway agreement. As far as these records show, that driveway belongs entirely to you. I asked her to check again. She did. Same answer. That's when something shifted in my head. Up until then, I had been trying to solve the problem politely. I kept assuming everyone would eventually do the right thing. But sitting there in that office, looking at those records, I realized something important. The people crossing my property weren't confused. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were betting that I wouldn't do anything about it. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I decided they might be wrong. 2 days later, a flatbed truck pulled into my driveway, carrying steel posts and a heavy black gate. And that's where things started getting interesting. 2 days later, a flatbed truck pulled into my driveway, carrying steel posts and a heavy black gate. And that's where things started getting interesting. Now, I wish I could tell you there was some dramatic movie montage where I spent days planning the perfect revenge, but honestly, it was much simpler than that. I owned the property. I had verified the records. I was tired of strangers treating my land like a public road. So I hired a contractor and installed a gate exactly where the driveway crossed a small bridge near the entrance. The bridge was important because it sat completely on my property. I paid for every repair, every load of gravel, every board that had ever been replaced. If somebody damaged it, I was responsible. If somebody got hurt on it, I was the one who could end up dealing with lawyers. Funny how nobody seemed concerned about that when they were using it for free. The gate wasn't flashy. It wasn't designed to make a statement. It was designed to do one thing and one thing only: remind people that property lines actually mean something. We finished installation on a Thursday evening. By Friday afternoon, the real show began. I was sitting in the barn organizing tools when I heard multiple engines outside. I stepped to the doorway and saw 4 vehicles rolling down the driveway. Leading them was the same realtor I had spoken to weeks earlier. She was smiling, chatting, giving her presentation, completely unaware that her shortcut had just become a dead end. The first SUV crossed the bridge, then the second, then the third. Once all of them were inside the property line, I walked to the gate and closed it. Slowly. No ruse, no jilling, no drama. Just the sound of steel meeting steel. The click of a lock. And silence. About 30 seconds later, confusion started spreading through the group. Drivers stopped. Doors opened. People pointed toward the entrance. The realtor noticed me standing near the gate and immediately marched over. "What is this?" she demanded. "A gate," I replied. "You can't close this while we're using the road." I remember smiling a little when she called it a road. Good thing it isn't a road then. Her face changed instantly. She knew exactly what I meant. The buyers standing nearby looked uncomfortable. One older couple exchanged glances. A younger man asked whether this was private property. Nobody answered him. The realtor tried again. "This is ridiculous." "So, is selling access to land you don't own?" I said. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then reality finally arrived. The only way out was the same way they had come in, which meant carefully backing multiple vehicles through a narrow section of driveway and across the bridge one at a time. A trip that normally saved 5 minutes suddenly cost nearly half an hour. I didn't celebrate. I didn't mock anybody. I just stood there and watched. Because sometimes consequences don't need commentary. They explain themselves. By Monday morning, my phone rang. Mason Hartwell. And, judging from the tone of his voice, he had spent the entire weekend hearing complaints. "What the hell are you doing?" he asked before I could even say hello. "Having breakfast," I replied. "Don't play games with me." "Then don't start conversations with yelling." There was a pause. Not because he was calming down, but because he was realizing I wasn't intimidated. People like Mason spend their lives surrounded by employees, contractors, and salespeople who depend on them. They're used to getting compliance. They're not used to hearing no. "You can't block emergency access," he said. "Interesting," I replied. "Show me the easement." Silence. A few seconds passed, then a few more. Finally, he changed subjects. That told me everything I needed to know. Because if the easement existed, he would have emailed it before finishing the sentence. The conversation ended badly, worse than the first one. But after that, something changed. Traffic dropped almost immediately. Not completely, but enough to notice. Some people got the message. Others apparently needed additional encouragement. So I added cameras, then larger signs, then reflective markers. One sign simply read private property. Another vehicle will be towed. That sign turned out to be surprisingly educational. About 10 days later, a contractor ignored every warning and drove through anyway. I happened to be home when it happened. I called the towing company I had already arranged to work with. 15 minutes later, that truck was heading down the highway behind a tow rig. The driver was furious. He shouted. He threatened. He claimed nobody had warned him. The tow operator literally pointed at 3 separate signs. Eventually, the driver left. Word traveled fast after that. Faster than any brochure. Faster than any sales pitch. Faster than any explanation Mason could give his buyers. Suddenly, people weren't interested in testing the rules anymore. The funniest part was watching the neighborhood's marketing materials slowly change. First, the maps disappeared. Then the route descriptions vanished. Then references to convenient highway access became much more vague. I may not have worked in real estate, but even I could read between those lines. The weeks that followed were strangely peaceful. I started noticing things I hadn't realized I missed. Mornings were quieter. Dust stopped drifting across my front porch every afternoon. My dog Ranger stopped barking at passing vehicles because there were hardly any left to bark at. I spent more evenings fishing at the pond, more weekends working in the barn. The property finally felt like mine again. Then one evening, I saw a black pickup pull into my driveway and stop outside the house. Mason stepped out. For the first time since all this started, he wasn't wearing the confident smile developers seem to manufacture in bulk. He looked tired, frustrated, older somehow. I invited him inside, not because I liked him, but because I wanted to hear what he had to say. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table my grandfather built decades earlier. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then Mason finally sighed. This situation isn't helping anybody. I almost laughed. It was an interesting choice of words considering he hadn't cared much about the situation when I was the only one suffering from it. Depends on who you ask, I said. My driveway's a lot quieter these days. He rubbed his forehead. Buyers are complaining. There it was. The real issue. Not fairness. Not property rights. Not neighborhood relationships. Buyers. Sales. Money. The things he actually cared about. Traffic backs up every morning, he continued. People get frustrated. Sounds inconvenient. He stared at me. I stared back. Finally, he leaned forward. What would it take? And just like that, the entire balance of power shifted. For months, he had acted as though my cooperation was automatic, something he was entitled to. Now he was asking permission. Real permission. Legal permission. The kind he should have requested from the beginning. I folded my arms and thought about everything that had happened. The brochures. The tours. The dismissive phone calls. The assumption that my property could simply be absorbed into his project because it made life easier. Then I gave him my answer. A recorded access agreement, I said. Multi-usage fee. A maintenance fund for the bridge. Full liability coverage. An insurance listing me as an additional insured party. Mason leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. That's expensive. So, is building a neighborhood around a road problem you never solved? His jaw tightened. For a moment, I thought he might get up and leave. Instead, he sat there quietly, doing math in his head, and I could practically see the calculation happening. The cost of fighting me versus the cost of working with me. The cost of delayed sales versus the cost of doing things properly. Eventually, he nodded once. Not because he liked the deal, because he had finally run out of better options. 2 weeks later, attorneys got involved, paperwork started moving, and for the first time since Willow Glen broke ground, everything was headed toward a real resolution. What I didn't know at the time was that the final chapter of this story would end up teaching both of us something neither one had expected. What I didn't know at the time was that the final chapter of this story would end up teaching both of us something neither one had expected. About 2 weeks after our meeting at my kitchen table, the paperwork was finished. Lawyers had reviewed everything. County officials had recorded the documents, insurance certificates had been delivered, And for the first time since this whole mess started, there was an actual legal agreement in place. Mason's company paid an upfront access fee of $3,000, agreed to contribute $1,500 every month toward maintenance and usage, and accepted responsibility for their share of liability connected to the bridge and roadway. On paper, it looked like a business arrangement. In reality, it was something much simpler. It was respect, finally written down in legal language. The morning the agreement became official, I unlocked the gate and watched the first vehicles pass through under the new terms. It felt different, not because the gravel looked any different, not because the bridge had changed, but because for the first time, every person crossing that property was doing so with permission instead of assumption. That distinction matters more than people realize. A few days later, I ran into one of the homeowners from Willow Glen at a local diner. He introduced himself and thanked me. At first, I thought he was joking. Then he explained that after the access agreement became public, several residents had learned what happened behind the scenes. Apparently, many of them were uncomfortable when they discovered the original sales materials had included a route nobody actually had rights to use. Honestly, he told me, stirring his coffee, most of us would have preferred they just worked something out with you from the beginning. That conversation stuck with me, because for months I had viewed the situation as me versus the neighborhood, me versus buyers, me versus traffic. But the truth was more complicated. Most of the people driving through my property weren't villains. They were operating on information somebody else gave them. The real problem had always been the people making decisions at the top and assuming nobody would challenge them. Around that same time, something unexpected happened. Mason started waving when he drove by. The first time I saw it, I almost laughed. After everything that happened, after all the arguments, all the frustration, all the phone calls, he gave a small wave through his windshield like we were neighbors who had simply disagreed about a fence line. I didn't wave back the first few times. Not out of anger. Mostly out of surprise. Eventually, I returned the gesture. We never became friends. Probably never will. But we reached something better than hostility. Boundaries. Clear boundaries. Funny enough, that's all I wanted from the very beginning. Months passed. Willow Glen filled with families. Kids started riding bikes through the neighborhood. Porch lights came on in the evenings. Life moved forward. The traffic issue disappeared because there was finally a system everyone understood. The gate remained in place. The access agreement remained in force. And every month the maintenance payments arrived exactly as promised. Sometimes people ask if the money made the fight worth it. The answer surprises them. The money was nice, sure. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But it wasn't the point. If somebody had offered me the exact same amount on day one and still treated my property like it belonged to them, I would have said no. Because this was never really about dollars. It was about choice. About the simple idea that ownership means something. About the right to decide what happens on land you've spent years maintaining, protecting, and caring for. My grandfather used to say that fences don't create bad neighbors. They create clear expectations. I didn't fully understand what he meant when I was younger. I understand it now. The gate wasn't punishment. The towing company wasn't revenge. The legal agreement wasn't greed. They were all versions of the same message. Ask first. Respect boundaries. Treat people fairly. Most conflicts never become conflicts if you do those three things. Every now and then I still sit on my front porch in the evening with a glass of iced tea and watch the sun disappear behind the trees. The barn is still there. The pond still drops too low every summer. Ranger is older now and spends more time sleeping than barking. Some evenings a few cars cross the bridge on their way to the neighborhood, and I barely notice them anymore. But every once in a while my eyes drift toward that black steel gate standing beside the driveway. And when they do, I remember the afternoon a realtor stood on my property and tried to sell my own driveway to strangers. I remember the brochure. I remember the phone calls. I remember the look on Mason's face when he realized the shortcut he had been using wasn't actually his to give away. Most of all, I remember learning something about human nature. A lot of people respect boundaries when they're clearly enforced. The trouble starts when they assume nobody will enforce them. Maybe that's why this story still stays with me. Not because I won, not because somebody else lost, but because the entire situation could have been avoided with a single conversation and a little honesty. Instead, people chose convenience over respect and ended up paying far more for it in the end. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have installed the gate the moment strangers started cutting through your property, or would you have handled it differently? And if you were one of the homeowners who bought into that neighborhood, who do you think was really responsible for the mess? The developer who created the shortcut, the realtor who advertised it, or the people who kept driving through private land without asking? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions, and honestly, that's what makes these conversations interesting. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes property rights, community respect, and common sense should still matter. I'll see you in the next one.